All right, YouTube, let's see if we're back on. Everybody say something and let's see what happens.
Yeah, I'm back on here as DS.
So and here's Timely Books.
Doesn't Metarog's here.
Is it switching?
Yes.
Yeah, switching.
All right.
It says.
Yeah.
It still says it's waiting for Bob here.
Well, I think that's just a lag, Roger.
Oh, okay. I just hit the wrong link. Okay, I'm sorry. There you go.
Yeah, we have to restart that because the best book we're likely to see during this chat is that Marvel Comics 4.
Without a doubt.
All right, Mike, go ahead and show off that book again if you don't mind.
Okay. So what I was saying was second Nazi cover ever, and first one for Timely's. And let's see, what else were we talking about? How bad the condition was.
No, how good it is.
Let's see. I was saying how I like to. I bought this, so I like to buy big books slabbed, but depending on what it is, I like to open them. Even if I think I won't, there's a good chance it won't last like a year. Sometimes I just need to know. I start wondering, like especially books like Strange Tales 110, where you don't really get to see the most important part, and you're like,
on the cover there's nothing. Yeah.
What if when I open that, someone like scribbled all over Doctor Strange's face? Like I gotta see if it's okay in there. So,
or what if they married the cover to an Archie comic?
You never know. It was interesting. I opened a bunch recently, and actually one of the Timelies I had, the top seal was actually open, which was kind of concerning to me. But all the others were okay. But that was the only time that I've ever seen that. But I was like, whoa, because you assume it's shut. But anyway, this is some nice Everett artwork. Then this is only technically it's the 5th appearance of the Submariner, but it's the first cover of him, and first time Alex Schomburg drew him.
Is that an Alex Schomburg cover?
Yeah,
that's nothing like his his 1939 drawing looks nothing like when he figured out how to do it. It's totally different.
And I have an example of what I think is one of the finest. I find my favorite is 43. I feel like he hit his peak, and here's one from that, and you could see just how different.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's like
so much packed into that.
And let's see, what else was that? Oh, one interesting thing about this cover is a little time before it, probably maybe a couple months or something, this came out, Life. And, maybe there's just a lot of pictures of subs or whatever, but it really reminded me of that,
For sure.
And
it's almost an homage cover.
It's almost like a mirrored homage.
It's not like he could use the internet for art reference. So.
The computers were all test tubes back then. Not even transistors.
Give this funny Lucky Strike ad. Well, I definitely have some more that we could show, but I don't want to jeopardize everything.
Before we move on from the Golden Age, I just wanted to say my stuff's mostly from the 50s because it's horror books, and the violent and horrific nature of that was a problem for a lot of people back then, and that's why it changed. But prior to that, there didn't seem to be any outcry at the time about stuff from the 40s, especially World War II related stuff that had very racial stereotypes of Japanese and Germans and Italians. The Axis powers were drawn very racist, along with African Americans, and pretty much, how it was back in the 40s. There was no outcry about that. And when I look back at books from the 40s and 50s, I find the most offensive stuff now to look back at was the stuff that was celebrated in the 40s, the World War II stuff, which has a lot of racist images and stereotypes on it. whereas the violence and horrific nature of the pre-code horror stuff by today's standards is lame. So sort of interesting 180 as far as what's offensive now for the comics back then as opposed to at the time.
I wonder if they wrote about that in that book, in the guidelines, like no racial stereotyping, I don't recall ever hearing that.
No, I don't think that there's anything like that. But, they had several failed attempts at codes at that time. In fact, DS has got one showing there. Show off that atlas on the far left you've got there, the 5.5 DS.
Oh, the Suspense 19.
Yeah. And in the bottom left-hand corner, just above the speech balloon or speech bubble, whatever that is, that there's a comic code there. And that's actually one of the older comic codes that went defunct because it was found to be it didn't work. People were putting things they would put that code on there, but then they would only put the stamp on there. They wouldn't actually change anything in the editing. They would just leave the stories and the images just the way they were. And then they would put that comics code on there. And so it wasn't working. So they they decided they needed a body behind all that, not just to put the stamp on there, but someone to actually police it.
Yeah, so pretty much the Comics Code Authority stamp, you're right, Bub, that's what that is. But when, they finally have that stamp up on the upper right, that's pretty much the demarcation between Golden Age and Silver Age. I was showing this one to Knights of Old. This is one of the latest, and he's got it out too. It's one of the latest Golden Age books that doesn't have the stamp. This is from May and June of 1955. So that's right on the cusp. I mean, the Comics Code stamp was starting to appear right around this time. This one got in sort of just under the line there, but this is a Frazetta cover, and it was originally supposed to be a Buck Rogers cover fighting a bunch of like zombies, and they watered that down, and he changed it to this, and they used it for this book. Doesn't have the stamp, but even still watered down, and this is one of the latest non-code approved books.
Check this one out, DS. So this is from this Frazetta Arc book, and I'm not entirely sure if he altered the original or what, but you could see it here with.
Oh, there's
helmet.
Buck Rogers, yeah.
Yep. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think that was originally supposed to be a cover to a Famous Funnies, and the Famous Funnies decided they didn't want to use it. And then EC said they'll use it if it was, a little watered down. So I think it was originally supposed to be a cover to a Famous Funnies issue.
I like the helmet one better for sure.
Yeah, I would have definitely preferred that be a Buck Rogers Famous Funnies cover, but it's still awesome.
Cool. This one, I just sold my downgraded copy of this one. I had this, I know, horror, right? So I had this Ladies' Home Journal from 1953, which predates the Comics Code of Authority and predates the Seduction of the Innocent. And it has the article by Frederick Wortham in here. And this book is kind of credited with the first time that it was spoken to parents and to anyone outside of the psychological community. So the idea was that this was the first invasion of the Comics Code propaganda, if you will, into the homes of America. And Wortham actually references this journal in the opening page of the Comics Code of the Seduction of the Innocent. He says, as previously stated in Ladies' Home Journal, November 1953. Yep. So it's a nice.
I've seen that reference. I've seen that reference several times.
And I don't own a copy of the Seduction of the Innocent. I would like to buy that book, but I am not willing to buy one that doesn't have the bibliography, because that is the key part to me is having it complete with that attached bibliography.
What is the deal with that bibliography again?
Well, they removed the bibliography, and then for later editions, they didn't even include it. And it was like a pamphlet inserted into the back that had a list of all the books that were cited and all the books that Wortham considered to be corrupting the youth. And so that bibliography is a very cool piece, and it's rare. It's hard to find out there.
It'd be fun to collect all those books.
Yeah, the publishers complained because they said that even though they changed, to fit the parameters of the code, that there was a stigma against their comics. So they petitioned to have that part removed, so at least they wouldn't be a direct correlation between their comics and the findings of Dr. Wortham.
Yeah, and I think it wouldn't surprise me if what is actually behind the removal of that was they didn't want to make it easy now that they brought this to the attention of America. Easy for people to get that list and go search out and find them, because you know, even bad publicity is going to raise interest in things. Yeah, exactly. So I got to believe that was part of it too. But
I found that page.
That might have been too. Yeah.
I found that page from this book. I'll say that again, just the American Comic Book Chronicles of the 1950s. Really cool book. And yeah, they go into it right here. And this is pretty cool. It lists the general standards, like what they can't have, dialogue, and religion, costume, marriage and sex. And then, yeah, it says this is reprinted from the 1954 Senate report. So I'm sure you could find that online, but I thought that was pretty cool. And then another little thing that I remember reading was kind of neat was this photo of comic book burning.
Oh, I can't even look at those.
Yep.
And they said it was likely staged for the media. So I found that interesting.
Yeah, it's okay, DS. All those comics that were burned had detached covers and restoration.
Yeah,
with the coupon cut out that affects story and art.
There were 9.4s of super rare books in those piles being burned.
You can only imagine what was in there.
Because some of those they took directly off the newsstand to go stage that fire. So they're like minty, fresh, perfect books. I mean, that's part of why this stuff is collectible now, but it still hurts to see those photos of that stuff being burned.
Absolutely.
It's just another little thing that the comics had to survive. You know, there was so much going against the comics from that age, you know, being passed around as like a major form of entertainment, you know, no TV and all that stuff. And then also like recycling, they encouraged them to recycle.
Oh
they had paper drives for the war.
Yeah. And then the burnings. And then, you know, people just throwing them out, just not thinking of it as collectibles. So it's part of what makes it so fun to collect, finding them, finding an example.
Absolutely. Guys, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge our people in our chat. Thanks for coming back to us. We got JPO, Rayman, Michael Dodd, Hialeah, Comic Bro. Look at that.
All right.
Yeah. Finally. C Wood, Comic Geek McD, Go To Geeks, Kelsang Inferno, Prowler 671, Simon Comics is here. So we've got quite a Probe 186 is here. He might be looking for a new channel name. We'll give him some. It's DS Loves Alliteration. So you can Matt at Funk Office here. So thank you all for coming back and catching.
Hey, let's remember to sub everybody up in the chat. Let's show some love in the chat there, guys. I just subbed up Michael Dodd because I hadn't been subbed to him. So let's follow suit.
I like it. Sometimes I get in there, like I do it on the rewind. So when I'm watching on the rewind, I'll go back and sub everybody. So if you don't get a sub from me, well, you know, I have a lot of technical responsibilities here, Roger. You understand? We can't all be just panelists, you know. Some of us are fighting YouTube and Google testicular difficulties or whatever they're called.
We appreciate all you do, Bub, because, you know, I would be totally lost, as is obvious the technology challenge that I am, the technologically challenged that I am.
Well, DS talking about how he was on that low-budget, second-rate show, the Wednesday Night Chat. And no, I'm just kidding. They're awesome.
Well, the link I got was different than the link I get from you. I had trouble getting on there, but
yeah, I think Dr. Von Chilla had trouble last week getting on there. So it's tricky. It can be tricky. Yeah, Discovery Bay Comics is back. Thank you guys for coming in and being part of them. We're just kind of going through the golden age, wrapping that up a little bit. Here's a superhero golden age, which we don't talk about much, but there's of course this is my downgraded copy. The real one is well, I don't own it yet. So somewhere somewhere there's an old like Studebaker I'm gonna buy, and there's gonna be a whole short box of these brand new, near mint, in the trunk, and then then maybe we can afford to move this to a Friday night show.
Yeah, and
So
this reminds me, the conforming propaganda and paranoia of the 50s wasn't only limited to the crime and the horror stuff, but Superman, Batman and Robin, Wonder Woman were all victims of this paranoia and this crackdown.
Yeah.
Across the board, everything. Now, I don't collect the other stuff, but all of it took a hit and was all targeted.
So I have a couple more if you want me to. Do you want to take turns or just keep going? Or
well, do we have any? Let's talk a little bit about the Silver Age.
Yeah.
See if we can get through some of that. So anybody want to take some books? Roger, you haven't shown any books yet. Officially. You want to throw a couple up from the Silver?
Officially.
Well, I mean, you've been cycling books down there in the,
Well, yeah. Most of the stuff I have is from the bronze and copper that I was going to show.
All right, that's enough out of you. Anybody got any seven?
That's enough out of me. It's a story of my life over here, man.
Oh, no.
I don't collect Silver Age, but I'm happy to throw out what I think are the two books that started the Silver Age.
Do it. We want to hear it.
So you got Marvel and DC are the big Silver Age. I really think Marvel lagged way behind DC in starting the Silver Age. The Golden Age is a hodgepodge of all sorts of different things: superheroes, horror, crime, romance, westerns, all that stuff. The Silver Age is the superhero, the era of the superhero, and Marvel fooled around with a lot of other stuff, monster stuff, and sort of the Atlas stuff, and a bunch of other stuff. DC hit the ground running with the superheroes because they already had, Batman and Superman, but they put out Detective Comics 225 is one of the earliest Silver Age comics. And that, along with Showcase 4, which is the first Silver Age appearance of the Flash, those are like the two, in my mind, the two key books that start the Silver Age. And the Showcase run had a lot of really early Silver Age keys, just the late 50s. You had 4 and 8 was the second Flash, and 22 was the first Green Lantern in the Silver Age. So DC really hit the ground running with the superheroes. Marvel really didn't get their act together with superheroes really until, obviously Amazing Fantasy 15 kicked it off. There was a couple smaller ones before that, but
FF number 1 was before that.
Oh, was it? See, I don't even know. I know those two were the first two, but I'm not a Silver Age.
Fantastic Four number 1 was a little before AF 15.
Yeah, so I mean that's early, right at the beginning of the '60s is when Marvel started with the superheroes. But it was like '56 was Showcase 4 for Silver Age Flash. So I think Showcase 4 and Detective 225 are the two Silver Age keys that start that era to me. So
yeah, I agree. I think Detective 225 is very underrated.
First Martian Manhunter, cool book,
and because he was an original, character. I mean, Flash was a version of the Golden Age. I mean, a new iteration, but he was still, the speedster. But Martian Manhunter was a new creation of the Silver Age.
And all the great Marvel Silver Age stuff. Tales to Astonish, Tales of Suspense, Strange Tales, all that stuff, which became superhero stuff, was all like these monster sort of prototype stories in the late 50s, second half of the 50s, and they really weren't getting any traction. They didn't know what to do with their company until Stan Lee threw out some of these big superheroes, and they took over the Silver Age.
Until this came out.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, nice. Well, you got one of those lying around, do you?
It was just,
wait, wait, he'll thumb through it.
Did you guys know that? You probably know, but that during that time they actually had some publishing deal that was somewhat controlled by DC, I guess, but they could only publish 8 books. I think it was 8 books a month.
Yep,
so that's right. Why they had to slowly. Then I think it was 1968 when they finally branched off and gave everything.
That's right.
Their own
That's
book.
when a whole bunch of new issues came out first from Marvel. They branched out Hulk and 102 and split it. With some
the big premiere issues.
Astonish, Submariner, and Iron Man and Tales of Suspense, Captain America and Iron Man. That's when they got the new distribution deal and were not under the DC distributor.
And the boy, if DC knew what was going to happen, they probably would have.
Yeah.
tried to shut that down. But I also
hey, Mike,
heard
move that book into the camera so we can see it.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's see that beauty.
Yeah,
I also
teasing us
heard
with the corner.
I also heard that the paper quality got better once they switched over as well, and there was the Marvel chipping was kind of gone. I believe the order was this. So you got the FF, then the Hulk, then this guy, then Thor,
33,
same month I think.
Yeah,
and then I like this one more than the 27, just because superhero outfit. Then we had Iron Man, and that's when he got his own series. And
you're killing me. You're killing me, Mike. You're killing me.
Every time they canceled, every time they started #1, they canceled a book. I can't remember what was canceled from this. Maybe it was the Hulk.
Yeah, Hulk was canceled. Yeah.
And then the X-Men. Yeah. I don't have the Avengers, but
well, I think you can safely say you have all of the first of the key #1s because the Avengers is not actually a true first appearance of anybody. So I think you've got all of them right there. That counts right there, and that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's a fun pile for sure.
I think so. Help me out, guys, because this is something that drives me crazy all the time in my Silver Age collection, especially with Marvel. So, but also DC. So, why is there such a big deal between a first Silver Age appearance versus a first appearance? Like, to me, the classic example is Vision, right? So people were, last year especially, collecting the crap out of the first Silver Age appearance of Vision. And I get that it's a classic looking cover and it's a cool cover, all the red and everything on there. But why is there so much attention paid to, like, Captain America, first Silver Age appearance of Captain America?
I'll tell you why. It's one simple reason, and it's price. People want to be able to have the first appearance of Captain America. Virtually nobody can afford the actual first appearance. So the Silver Age first appearance is sort of like, it is a first appearance that people can afford. I think that's it.
It's true.
Cap 1 is hundreds of thousands of dollars. The Silver Age is thousands of dollars. A huge difference. I think price is it. And
it's also part of the story too, right? Like the Golden Age one, even me, it took me a while to get in the Golden Age. I saw them at the cons growing up and stuff, but they weren't like connected story wise or anything. Like Stan Lee wasn't, you didn't read a comic and it didn't say like, check if you missed Marvel Mystery number 46, you better go to your comic. It all started with the FF. So, it felt like a totally kind of irrelevant in some ways.
So you're talking about, you're saying that the Silver Age brought with it a continuity with characters that the Golden Age lacked.
Well, it's just no one talked about it. It wasn't part of it. It's kind of like how I feel about modern age. I don't know what the heck is going on. How many versions of Cap are out there now? So I just don't feel the need to really read it, or it just doesn't feel like it's connected to the Cap that I know.
And they retconned a lot of those characters. Captain America's Captain America.
Yeah.
But like the Human Torch, the Golden Age Torch is an android. The Silver Age Torch is a completely different person. It's a completely different entity. It's not the same individual at all. So some of them are completely different. Some are continuations of the older characters. But it's so expensive to pick up the Golden Age first appearances. They're hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the Silver Age ones are much cheaper, and some of them are completely different characters. The Human Torch is totally different.
They did bring back the original Human Torch in FF Annual, I think 4 or 5, maybe.
Yep.
And
with the Quasimodo story. Yeah.
Did you hear about how Carl Burgos? I don't know his name, how to pronounce his last name, but he was the creator of the original Human Torch. Apparently, when that book came out, that annual, bringing back the original Human Torch, which they kind of had to do for some rights or something, he went out in the backyard and just burned all his original Human Torch artwork that was left. Wow. He was so mad because apparently that made it so he couldn't get any rights back, because he had some kind of hope to do it, because Joe Simon had some success with the with some kind of rights with Captain America, but yeah.
Wow, that's terrible.
Wow,
that was a burning I wouldn't want to see for sure.
Oh, what a shame.
Yeah, and they a lot of times they disconnect. They did the same thing between the Silver and the Bronze Age too. When you look at like the original Ghost Rider and from the westerns, right? And a lot of people say, "Oh, there's no connection between the white Ghost Rider from the westerns and the Marvel Spotlight #5 Ghost Rider." Here you go, Roger. I know you're dying to see that. Marvel,
you know it. I'm dying to see it here in my room even more. But yeah,
I'm working on it.
Someday.
They say there's no connection between those two, but then they go forward in I forget what issue it is of Ghost Rider proper, and introduce the Western Ghost Rider as the original Ghost Rider, and they make him part of the story and kind of retcon the existence. So they actually appear together in a couple of comics. I think
Ghost Rider
play. Yeah. So I think that they play with those relationships between the older aged characters and the modern, and what would have been the modern version, quite a bit. Just I don't know if it's to retain rights every time, but they certainly want to make those connections going forward.
Yeah, that old Ghost Rider is really cool. He's just it's the all white horse and the all white uniform, the faceless white. He's got the white hat, the white cape. Looks like the Lone Ranger, all in white. And some of those have really awesome Frank Frazetta covers on those. Yeah, those are really phenomenal Frazetta covers. And I think that then the newer Ghost Rider really had nothing to do with that other than the name. So I didn't even know they brought the other one back. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, they actually brought them back. They brought back different versions, because then they did reprints. They called him the Knight Rider.
Yeah, they changed his name.
Yeah, okay, I think I've heard of that. Yeah,
and then later on they called him the Phantom Rider. So they've evolved him, but he was that character. I mean, it looks exactly like that character. He is that character, but they just didn't want to confuse it with the Ghost Rider from the Silver Age. So that's why they changed the name. Even on the comic, they put it as Knight Rider, even though originally, as written, it was Ghost Rider. They just changed the text to match.
Yeah, I think the only character that has never changed over time is probably Archie. It's probably the only one you could not find any significant changes with from the 40s.
Well, he used to have buck teeth, and now he got braces at some point.
Well, yeah, he grew up a little bit, but that character's been the same forever. All the other characters either change entirely, or their uniforms change, or something.
Yeah. Well, in the Golden Age, the characters bore little resemblance to what they are today. Superman and Batman, you wouldn't even recognize them.
Superman couldn't even fly initially. I mean, he wasn't.
Yeah, he just left the buildings.
Right, he was able to jump really high, but he didn't have the ability to fly even.
So. I liked it better. I was watching this weekend. I was watching a bunch of the old Dave Fleischman cartoons.
I love those.
Those are fantastic, and I had the whole set. There's 17 of them. They spanned. They took a director change, I think, somewhere around number 11. But they're all 17 of them, and he's leaping. Able to leap tall buildings in a single bound, and he really does bounce around, kind of like the Hulk does. When the Hulk jumps, he can't fly either, but he can jump across a mountain, kind of stuff. And it's fun to watch Superman do that as opposed to fly. I think it was a much more interesting character before he could fly.
I think the flying actually was an accident, because they brought on a new artist who didn't know anything about Superman, and looking at some previous panels in the previous book of him jumping, the artist assumed that Superman flew. Didn't really know the history. They just brought him on. So when he drew the next issue, he drew Superman flying. And it got out there. And then a next artist drew him not flying. And then there's a difference between an Action Comics and a Superman title. And it's not even really clear when he started flying. But it was an accident by an artist who really didn't understand that Superman couldn't fly and drew him flying.
Did you have
crazy stuff about that? There's a bunch of articles about when he got certain powers, because there was three things happening kind of around the same time. Was the comic, and then there was the dailies, in the newspapers, and then also those cartoons. So it's like,
yeah. I thought you were working on a little side project on that DS. Did you abandon that?
Well, I didn't abandon it, but it's on hold right now. I did do some research on it, and it looks like the flying and the not flying sort of overlapped with some gaps, and there's not really a clear starting point. There's one cover in particular where he's definitely flying on the cover, and I think that's the first flying Superman. But I can't remember off the top of my head what it is. But I think that same artist actually mistakenly drew Lex Luthor bald because he mistook Lex Luthor the previous issue as one of the bald characters. He didn't look at it closely enough, and he assumed that one of the bald characters in the previous story was Lex Luthor, so he drew Luthor bald, and he just drew the wrong character. I think that's how Lex Luthor became bald too. So there's a lot of funky stuff in those early Action Comics and Superman books. And
it's funny, you know, they really didn't care back then either. I mean, we're going over the minutia now, but at that time, you know, it's more like the prevailing thought was, well, the kids aren't going to care or notice. Let's keep moving on.
Yeah, and the TV shows and the TV shows, they like Superman flies. We're making him fly, so they just did him flying in the show, and that got that was super popular. So I think the comic ultimately just gave in to the popularity of the show and made Superman fly. So it might have even been the TV show that was the impetus for him getting the power to fly ultimately.
You're talking about the George Reeves.
The George Reeves show.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could jump out the windows, and
it's a super interesting history to go back and look at how things changed with Superman early in the Action Comics and Superman titles in relation to the TV show, and then how that progressed, because they had a lot of different artists coming on at the time too, and there was a lot of variations in some of those early issues. It's a really cool history, and I started looking into it to determine when he first flew, and all I did eventually was not get an answer to that question, but learn some really cool stuff about early Superman. So
sounds like DS is gonna get into some superhero collecting.
If I had enough money, man, I would buy everything, but I've got to focus. I don't have enough. I got to pick my spots, and I pick one thing and I go with it. If it was up to me, I'd be collecting everything.
I don't think it'd be safe in your collection, because I could just see you with a stack of those books, and you'd sell them in a heartbeat if the right Golden Age book came around.
Yeah,
or the right two.
I love Golden Age, like horror books and some of the funky, like basically non-superhero Golden Ages and stuff I love. So
you see what Knights of Old is showing there?
Here's a nice one.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This I had to sacrifice many timelies for this one. But it's one of my favorite. You know, I know I don't foresee ever getting Action 1, but this was one of my favorite covers of him. I think is the fourth cover.
Yeah.
Pretty cool.
Wow.
That was fantastic.
That's beautiful. Beautiful. But that the size of that train gives you an idea of the power that level that they had for him.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and the Golden Age art is just so it's the elegance in it is sometimes the simplicity, the bold colors, the striking scene. There's not a lot of like, you know, George Perez or Frank Frazetta detailed line work in a lot of that stuff. And that's sort of the charm. It's got an elegance in its simplicity sometimes.
Yeah.
DC, and they're oversized too, so they're larger than life when you hold them.
DC did a good job. I remember reading something about how they really wanted their covers to not have a lot of like text on it, not be too flashy, be kind of like action, but not too crazy going on, you know, which is a shame in some ways, because I would have loved to see what Alex Schomburg would do with like Superman flying through like some Nazi planes and stuff. That would have been awesome.
Yeah, Schomburg covers are definitely busy. They're the opposite of what I'm saying about the early Supermans. Yeah.
Can you imagine LB Cole doing Action Comics and Superman?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Oh, yeah, good stuff.
It'll be a trippy blacklight poster with Superman drowning in a sea of melted faces somewhere. That would be awesome, and I'd be all over that.
Yeah,
I'd be on top of
that. Oh man. Well, guys, how far did we get? The Silver Age?
Keep going.
Yeah, I want to hear.
Keep going?
Yeah, I want to hear Bob and Roger talk about the Bronze Age, because you guys have extensive Bronze Age knowledge and collections. So.
Yeah, sorry guys. I don't mean to.
Oh no, you're good.
Oh,
we love it.
No,
That's the whole point.
That's
really.
Okay. You're forgiven.
I usually don't talk much in these things. I just let Roger and DS have fun. I'm just, I really just want people to, there's a lot of channels out there to choose from. There's tons of chats and there's things like that. And it seems like a lot of them, and I'm not knocking any of those because I enjoy watching them too, but they seem to be very, loose discussion based, which is fun. And then a lot of competing on who has the better books and, what did you pick up this week and all that kind of stuff. And I enjoy those too, but we kind of wanted this chat to be real informative. And if you come to the No Faces chat, hopefully you'll walk away knowing something you didn't know when you started watching it, and you got to see some kick-ass books along the way. So that's kind of the idea. So having you on tonight and going through some of the finer details, especially with the publication histories, I love that kind of stuff. And seeing some great coverage. It's really what this chat's all about. So I appreciate you being here and showing all the cool stuff you got. For sure. Bronze Age, I say that starts the Bronze Age. And Roger is welcome to argue with me as much as he wants. We'll do this together. But to me, the reason that this starts the Bronze Age is because it had a social awareness built into it that the Silver Age really did not have. In the Silver Age, you have the acknowledged. Well, of course, in Golden Age, you had war. So the villains were always easily found. They were readily available at all times. In the Silver Age, it seemed like there were more fantasy villains being created at all times, more evil doers and more evil entities, or that there was a good and evil always at play in the Silver Age, and the evil was more or less created in the same way that the good was created by the writers and by the creators. And in the Bronze Age, it really brought it back down to the street level for most titles in both DC and Marvel. They really brought it back down to there's good that needs to be done in the world, and the villains are the same villains that everyone is facing, kind of these societal governmental type villains. That to me is what the Bronze Age mostly represents, this feeling and this connection that that we can all kind of be heroes, and that being a hero is less a matter of what planet you came from or something like that, or some freak accident, and more about doing the right thing at the right time. So, Roger, what do you think about that?
Well, first of all, very impressive, Bub. I honestly, some of those points are, I can't retort because they're on point, right? I will say that I'm gonna go at it from a different perspective, because I agree with you, and conflict is what breeds interest, right? Mm-hmm. But very well said. And beyond that, I'd say that the Bronze Age had a different mentality for the comic book as a medium, and the comics were becoming more almost like large graphic novels. The continuity was much tighter. The respect for readers was much greater. So that means that what happened 20 issues ago is still valid, years later. And Marvel was, of course, much better at that than DC, because DC had the editorial staff was a little looser with, especially the crossovers. Sometimes there would be characters that had already been killed off, and they would show up in a title, and then they would be, retroactively said, "Oh well, they weren't really dead," or something like that. Yeah, I mean, it happens, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, there's when you have 50 titles or whatever, I mean, that's a lot to keep track of from a month-to-month basis, right? But I will say that the Bronze Age, beyond the continuity, and again, and that's just something that was a characteristic of the Bronze Age beyond the Silver Age. Silver Age was a lot looser, although Marvel did have obviously a lot of crossovers, not a lot, but did have crossovers in the Silver Age. I think Deadpool 2323 was talking about it in one of his videos, how those early crossovers were kind of rare in the early Silver Age, because again, unless you had the same writers and editorial staff, they didn't want you to mess with their characters. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And Stan Lee was writing the vast majority of them, so he could sort of get away with that. But look here, DS was talking about how in the post-Wartham era, they had the comics code, and so things like werewolves, vampires,
yes.
zombies were kind of taboo, because those were considered, figures, or they were characters that were not conducive to good behavior for teenagers, shall we say. I don't know what teenagers are going to imitate a werewolf, but I didn't. Again, I wasn't around when those trials were going on, right? So here, I believe this is 1971. We started to reintroduce these type of characters. By the way, I think Conan #1 is also a very seminal Bronze Age issue.
Yeah.
Right? Because now we're talking about one. You don't have that one yet?
I don't have Conan #1. I've got your Marvel Spotlight there, but I don't 2, right? Marvel Spotlight 2?
2, right.
I've got that one. Yeah, that's one of my favorite books. That was really my first big Bronze book that I ever got. I fell in love with it. But yeah, cool. I don't have a Conan. I need to get one of those.
Yeah, I don't either. Obviously, I'll be showing it.
Let's buy 2 and we'll split them.
Okay, well, let's go for it. So those, to me, those are the ones that kind of, and at least in, DS was talking about Showcase 4 and Detective 225, and I agree with that. And I really would put even more emphasis on Detective 225, but that's a road we've already gone down. Mm-hmm. But I would say that Conan and this issue really started expanding now what comics could do, what comic companies could do with characters. Now they had it sort of relaxed the code. The code is still there, but now you're not going to see a werewolf tear somebody and body parts go everywhere. That's not going to happen, But off camera, if he lunges at somebody and then you see a leg, off panel, or just and the rest of the body off panel, that's okay. That's innuendo, but it's okay because it's not showing the actual gore.
And they also you could show a little of the occult, which wasn't allowed either, and nothing mystical. Your Spider Woman, your Tomb of Dracula, all that stuff. If it wasn't just wholesome, completely wholesome, they just wouldn't allow it. But in '71, they started loosening that back up.
And the monsters and creatures they brought back in the '70s. In the '50s, the stuff I collect is rife with occult and monsters and people being torn to shreds by werewolves. That happens routinely in the books that I love. But it seems like when they brought it back in the '70s, these monsters now had personalities, and they had something about them you maybe liked, and they had a life of their own. They weren't just the image of the monster. And the occult and the monsters, like the Werewolf by Night, the Tomb of Dracula, they were characters with personalities and ongoing storylines, as opposed to mine were just one-off monster stories. So they're much more sophisticated in the '70s, using some of the same monsters that they had in the '50s.
Yeah,
correct. Good point.
DC was very inventive, though. Now they were still at this time doing more or less one-off stories with their monsters. They hadn't brought much continuity to their monster titles, but they also got in the game around the same time as well. And you've got, House of Secrets '92 is a nice, just popular example of, to me, one of the best transitions of monster to superhero that we have. It's one of the best examples, because even Werewolf by Night, you don't get very much superhero work with Werewolf by Night. He's more or less just a guy that constantly gets trapped, beat up, and then finally escapes. That's like every Werewolf by Night story is pretty much the same as that. But the idea that you could have a monster like Swamp Thing, who really didn't even have a title really or a name. He wasn't a superhero of any kind. And then you start through the years transitioning him into a much more superhero role that sought out to do good, not just, pining over an ex-wife, you know. But you know, I mean, it kind of developed into much more of a presence of a superhero, and so DC did pick up the ball, but really the monster titles for Marvel, I think, are pretty much where it's at. You know, that's the early bronze right there.
And my view on what started the bronze goes along. I've been looking at what Knights of Old has on his screen. ASM 121 and 122 were the first, a big first iconic books that brought sort of that darkness that the 70s is known for over the lighthearted good versus bad, superhero versus villain fights of the 60s. You know, that was a dark storyline, that 121 and 122 at the time. There was, you know, the death of Gwen Stacy, the Green Goblin eventually died in that, although he was resurrected sort of later on. But that was a dark storyline that didn't happen. Nobody really died in the 60s. And that was, you know, 1970. The 2-issue story arc, I think, was huge and sort of kicked off a bit of a darker sort of storyline, a more serious storylines in comics in the 70s.
Yeah, they were more real. Realism was a lot closer. I mean, you know, when you say comics, people don't think of realism, but it was certainly a lot closer. The characters were much more three-dimensional. They had families, they had jobs, they had troubles, they had to pay taxes, you know, et cetera, et cetera.
They were street-level heroes, you know, for the most part, you know, and now later you get Galactus and all this kind of stuff. But, you know, the idea that they were doing good on that you could have a universe with so many superheroes because they weren't all patrolling the same blocks, you know. It was, most of them could not fly or get around. They were all very contained in their areas and doing, you know, just trying more or less to live life as a superhero, but also have another life, you know, outside of that. It's a great, it's my favorite.
And I was going to say, I want to hear Knights of Old. He's got the book out. I want to hear his view on this.
Well, I mean, you guys did a great job talking about this one, but I always think of Bronze Age as a time when people really started paying attention to artwork, and I felt that the artists of that time really, it was like almost a renaissance, you know, of, you know, like you take a look at this and you talk about realism, like Neil Adams, you know, certainly brought a great rendering style, you know, if you could see that, the way he drew his Ant-Man, you know, all these books, the artist, it was like the second, well, I don't want to say like the second batch, because I feel like the 50s had like some amazing, were really the second batch, like Wally Wood and you know, a bunch of other guys I don't really know too much about, but I felt like, I wonder if the realism style, like, you know, that Adams brought, because, you know, once someone does anatomy and just such a fine job of rendering these guys, like, you kind of had to step up your game a bit. And I wonder if that also helped readers, you know, since the monster stuff was being drawn probably better, if people kind of believed it a little more or something, you know. And also I wanted to, you guys brought up Conan. I don't have number one, but I mean, the artwork that was being done by Barry Smith was just mind-blowing.
Yep.
Yeah,
agreed.
I mean, look at that, it's incredible. But,
again, but you have that the theme is that now we have sword and sorcery, which I think Bub kind of hinted about, that was kind of a taboo thing, you know, like Conan would have all these mystical opponents, and you don't, and then of course you had Doctor Strange, which had come in the Silver Age, right? And but again, he was mystical, but his opponents, you know, were also, you know, not Mephisto, you know, all kinds of images of devils and demons, et cetera, et cetera. Those were not very prevalent before the Bronze Age, but they were again more. They were there perhaps, but they were much more front and center, much more in your face in the Bronze Age.
Yeah, and I feel like as a child who grew up in the 80s, I always thought that Conan was one of the most iconic comic books and comic book characters that led to the Dungeons and Dragons revolution of the 80s that still goes on today with like Magic the Gathering and all those other type of games. I feel like Conan was the first big iconic comic book that sort of kicked off a fantasy craze in pop culture, so to speak.
And Frazetta's Conan novels too, where I think in the late 60s or early 70s were pretty big. And I think Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit became pop culture-ish as well.
Yeah, those Warren publications in the 60s obviously predated Conan, but it wasn't in comic books proper that until like Conan came around as the first huge comic book. But yeah, prior to that, the Warrens, the Creepies, and stuff like that, a lot of fantasy influences. I mean, nothing like that ever existed before, really.
I think too, a part of this that we're not mentioning too much, I don't know, we're talking primarily about comic books here, but I think that the transition, we didn't talk about really the pulp mags back when we were talking, golden/silver. We didn't talk much about the pulp mags, but I think that had an influence as well. And when you get into the Bronze Age, you're looking at a lot of fanzines, and I think those had a real strong influence too. And you had a lot of the same artists. You had Barry Windsor Smith. You had guys going back and forth. You talk about Vampirella coming into play. You're talking about the truly painted landscapes that were being done at that time for both Conan and for like Vampirella. And that painted really, it brought it into a whole nother level of artwork. More than just kind of a cartoonish draw. It was really works of art, and some of them slightly demonic, if you will, but just kind of fantasy driven. And the idea that you could have blood showing on a cover and it be sexy, that you could have Conan with his 3 barely scantily clad women at his feet, kind of thing, and it be okay, and that kind of painted art just really, I think, elevated the Bronze Age out of the Silver Age as being a collectible medium.
Yeah, here's a late 60s Frazetta Conan painting he did. The stuff you'd see on vans, I guess.
He also did a lot of album covers.
And those look exactly like the covers to the old Dungeons and Dragons user manuals or whatever they're called. It's like that's what's on them.
Yeah, you got dragons and snakes, and it's amazing. He just had a birthday recently, I think.
Yeah, I'm showing this one for you, DS, since you're the big horror guy. Here's another title. I'm working on a video about this series actually. This came along right in the 74, 75. A very odd little footnote in the Bronze Age that Archie actually did a horror series, horror series for about a year. And so I thought you'd like this Headless Horseman here, DS.
Yeah, I like that. I've never seen that before, actually. That's really cool.
You know me, I love the obscure stuff. So
yeah, what is that? Sorcery? What is who's? Well,
I'm going to do a video on it in a few weeks, so hang tight. But it was a very interesting backstory to this, how this came about. Remember, Archie was always wholesome. They never had any kind. Well, they did have superheroes and things like that in the past, but they mostly were very wholesome. Teenage titles, things like that. And this was one year they allowed Gray Morrow to do a horror mystery kind of 2 titles, and it apparently just didn't work, and it just went to obscurity. But these are pretty good. They have top flight artists in here. Vicente Alcazar. There's Gray Morrow himself. A lot of the Filipino artists were in here. Really good stuff.
Was that Martin Goodman?
I'll talk about that another day. But the last thing I wanted to show, Bub, I think you sort of hinted on this. We're not even talking about the underground movement in the Bronze Age.
We're not in Zap. We're not in any of the
all the Robert Crumb stuff.
Oh yeah, we're not even.
But that's important. That's an important era when you think about it.
It is.
When you're talking about the counterculture revolution at the time, those are important. That reflected what was going on in society.
I'm from New York, and you're talking Greenwich Village underculture there. just the birth of that kind of, which is funny because it's the same kind of sadist stuff that DS likes in the Golden Age, the torture covers and all this kind of stuff. But there was a real sexual undertone to those independent comics. It wasn't even undertone. Sometimes it was just right out at
overt.
you.
Yeah, it was overt. Yeah,
yeah, it was overt. Yeah. But the comics in the Bronze Age, you had that underground, kind of black and white interior comics that really started taking off. And now they weren't just for kids anymore. Comics, I think, matured in the Bronze Age to where they weren't for the youngest of us, but there was something for everyone at this point.
I wondered if that red circle was the same as this. It's that sorcery book. It said red circle.
Yeah. Yeah, they used that kind of imprint, I guess, to sort of differentiate from the more wholesome Archie comics.
Because Red Circle was the Marvel Timely's publication before.
Yeah, that was one of them. They used several, I believe, but yeah, that's one of them. Yeah, that's
cool.
That's a nice one there, Knights of Old.
And I've got these two Robert Crumb books. I'm having a hard time finding a page that would be appropriate to even show.
Yeah, there.
That's the problem.
So there's a Mr. Natural.
There's a Mr. Natural.
Or Mr. Natural #3.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can't even really open that on here. Or this one. This stuff is just lewd to the extreme.
Yeah, I was gonna show some of that too. I've sold most of my collection of that stuff. Just because there are some real rabid collectors out there who love it. And if you have first prints, oh man, those things go for some good money. So I've sold most of my stuff like that. I picked up, as you guys know, some of you guys know, I had picked up, just so we're not trying to say that the Bronze Age was the only sexually deviant age. I mean, you can go as far back to these Tijuana Bibles. And we've got some real interesting stuff going on in there,
Oh yeah, that's a whole other animal. But yeah, sure.
Yeah, there's a couple of Popeye Tijuana Bibles there that I just keep in my collection, just as a reminder that stuff has always been crazy,
Oh, certainly. We can go back to the beginning of time, really, if you want to do that. I mean,
cave paintings, right?
Yeah, when you're talking. Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the petroglyphs and all that what they depict. I mean, you can go way back.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just horror and stuff in the Bronze Age. We also had a big superhero boom for the Bronze Age too. And and again, when the X-Men were battling, yeah, they were evil, right? They were evildoers for sure, but they were also constantly battling just the undertone of racism and them being marked as outsiders and having that duality role of being someone who was there to help and save, but also someone who was feared and riled against. So.
Yeah, they were discriminated against. They were a group, just like a race or a religion that were discriminated against in comics because they were mutants and they were considered different and threatening and unknown and mysterious. So yeah, very, very good point.
That's a great book. I recently have been into completing my X-Men, like the run from up until 143. From the giant size, and I'm just surprised at how old that was, because I mean, it's really sophisticated stories for being.
You make me feel good, Knights of Old. You make me feel real good. I bought that off the stands. Okay,
that's awesome.
I don't have it anymore, but I did.
I bought this copy off Metarog, so no.
Did you think it was gonna be? I mean, did you have any clue? Like,
no.
Yeah.
No. I was a snot-nosed 11-year-old. I just bought it because it looked cool. That was it. That was the long and the short of my logic for buying it.
You say that, Roger, but I've talked to a lot of creators since I've been since I've delved into the convention scene the last few years, and I love to ask creators, so when did you know? When did you know this was a big hit? When did you know that this was going to be huge? And they all answer the same way, which I think doesn't exist anymore. So it's worth mentioning. And that's the letters. They said back then, fans wrote letters to the publishers. And
that's true. That's true.
And as soon as we would have a new comic out there, then if it was a hit, the fans let us know, not just in sales, because let's be honest, we bought everything, right? If we could. But they would send letters that said, I love this character and here's why. And they would read those letters as a group of writers usually, and they would incorporate ideas from the letters to make the characters better, and they really made the characters fit to what the fans wanted and were reacting to. And that's something obviously today is the exact opposite. Like we're told as fans, if you don't like this, there's something wrong with you, as opposed to giving the people what they wanted. So
yeah, that's anyway. A good point. That's a good point. But when you're talking about that particular one, the X-Men were doing reprints previously to that. They had an appearance in Captain America and a Marvel team up, and that was it. And they were just really just in limbo, that literally. So when that came out, I was like, oh, it's a number one. It's cool looking. Of course, I already had the Hulk 181 in my collection, and I recognized Wolverine there. So I said, let me get it, And
you recognize it even with his bigger, ears there? You recognized him anyway?
Well, I recognize because of the yellow suit. Yeah.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
I got to say, I'm a fan of the old suit. I really do I like the tapered ears. I like when they brought that back for the Astonishing X-Men run that Whedon had done with John Cassaday. I like that. I like that. That was one of my favorite.
Yeah, my favorite Wolverine is the early '80s brown and yellow suit.
Yeah,
has the big ear ears and eyepiece sort of. Yeah, that guy. The one piece front.
Nobody's a fan of the Fang costume.
It's okay. Honestly, I never had any appreciation for
the orange one.
Yeah, the dark brown.
Kind of the brown had that collar with the bones.
Yeah.
I didn't care for it too much then, but I tell you, and I never have really cared for X-23, the girl Laura, whatever. But there's a couple of covers where she wears that Fang costume, and it's never looked better. Like that's who it belongs on. That is a fantastic cover for her.
You know why they got her? Why they got rid of that Fang costume?
Why?
It was too tough to draw.
Yeah.
It was too tough to draw. They were like, it took me forever to draw that. Byrne was like, hated it. He's like, it took me forever to draw that thing well.
That's how we ended up with the brown and gold costume.
Yeah, they wanted to make it a lot simpler. Yeah,
it was simpler, and they did it on purpose. He knew he was leaving the book, so he went ahead and put a hard to draw costume on there as a thumb to the next guy. So
you got it. It was a finger to you got it. Yeah. And actually that Hulk 181 is actually a seminal issue too when you think about it, because we're talking about introducing a Canadian superhero.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
You had Captain Canuck and his own comic, but as far as in mainstream comics, I couldn't think of another one.
Well, they had done this as a response. There were so many Canadians reading comics, and they were clamoring for their own hero. So the editors say, we need to get one. Make me one now.
Right.
So they just don't do that anymore. It's just not a thought of theirs.
I disliked so much, and apparently some people really liked it, and I was really surprised to hear that recently. But in the 80s, which is when I started, I loved Wolverine, but he was only in the X-Men, and then he had the limited the 4-issue Miller series, but I was too broke to buy those. But finally he was getting his own series. And then they bring him back with he looks like this kind of old man with an eye patch. And I was just like, what the heck is this? I want Wolverine.
First appearance
apparently a lot of people love that. I don't know. It was interesting.
Well, what's funny, when I first started rereading these comics, right, and going back, I started with the first ongoing series of Wolverine. And I've got all those now. But when I first started reading it, it was like, this is driving me crazy. Where's Wolverine? Plus, they would put him on the cover every now and then in the proper costume. I was like, this is ridiculous. Where's Wolverine? But then once they finally brought his costume back in and everything, which is funny too, because there's a point in the comics, I forget what issue it is, but it's in the first, 15 or so issues of Wolverine Volume 1, where he finally admits that he is Wolverine, not this patch fella. And everyone laughs. Everyone who knows him laughs and says, dude, who else has hair like that? We knew who you were this whole time. We just figured you needed your space. So, so they even acknowledge it in the comic how ridiculous it was. But then, like as I'm reading on through the volume, I kind of start missing Patch. And I'm like, man, I kind of like that outfit. I kind of liked what he was doing, the adventures he had. It was kind of like a James Bond type adventure. I said, I kind of missed those. So I understand it. It's probably not my favorite costume of his, although as DS will probably remind everybody, I did cosplay as Patch this past year. Tuxedo and all, man, I was with it. But I did enjoy it. So I do like the Patch ones. So there you go.
Speaking of a stereotypical issue, look at what Knights of Old is showing there.
Okay. So I did want to bring this one up because I thought that as soon as Pearl Harbor hit, then you kind of got the slew of every publisher went into anti-Axis covers, and it was just everyone against all that once America went to war finally. But this was one of the first timelies after Pearl Harbor, and like DS was saying, how they really dehumanized the Japanese people to make them appear as monsters or whatever.
Look at the fangs, and the
but
exaggerated,
it's very classic cover. You started it, now we'll finish it. And it was quite a number of years after.
That's a beautiful yellow background cover there. Beautiful.
Yeah, I like how it doesn't have the usual timely caps. Have a cutoff right here.
Yeah, you're right. That's right. I never
nice full cover. Pretty cool.
Yeah, and it has that kind of diagonal banner on the left there. That's cool.
All out for America. Remember Pearl Harbor. I don't think they'll forget that. Yeah, this was like maybe 3 months after, because they had to wait. They had to draw it real quick, and it was interesting. I have this theory, and I'm not sure about it, but that Schomburg, because there's a lack of Schomburg timely covers right at the war, right as we went into war, and I'm wondering if what happened there, like if he's just stocking up, or he had to change stuff, or I don't know. It's surprising how popular Schomburg is, but there's really not much information out there on him, and there's like 1 or 2 books, but they're not that great, really. So
yeah, the Schomburg book I have doesn't go into a ton of the history. It's mostly just showing his cover art. As opposed to the L.B. Cole book I have, which spends the first third of the book just discussing the history and biography of L.B. Cole. So, yeah, I agree with you. I'm not sure either. But, guys, I got to run. So.
Yeah, I do too. I think we got all the way up to pretty much we covered the bronze. So all we're missing is copper and modern or platinum or whatever they want to call it these days.
Oh, I got a lot more for bronze. I got a lot more I can add.
Okay,
not
well
today.
then
not today.
Let's say we pick up some of this next week as well. How's that sound?
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah,
we haven't even talked about the magazines and all that stuff. So
yeah, Knights of Old, you want to come back next week? Are you available?
Well, I wish I could, but since I'm on the West Coast, I'm still in the middle of the workday, so unfortunately.
All right, well, how about this? We'll suspend this topic until you're available. I'll bring you back, and then we'll go from there. Does that sound good to everybody?
Sounds great.
Yeah, that's good. Knights of Old, I really appreciate you being here. I know it was short notice, and you said you were going to be able to make it, so I'm really glad we were able to have you here.
Yeah, very happy I got snowed in.
Couldn't have worked out better, right?
Wow. Thanks so much.
All right, guys. Well, thank you all for joining us on the No Faces Comic Chat. If we have time, we'll each say our typical goodbyes. Roger, we'll start with you.
All right, everybody. Thanks again for joining us, even though we had some technical difficulties. You guys are awesome. Remember to be blessed, be back, and be blessed. Both.
Yes. Thank you. And DS, go for it.
All right, I'm going to sign off quick. Everybody do your homework. It's been a blast. See you next week.
Thanks, man. And Michael, do you have a sign off? I don't think so.
Thanks a lot. And I hope, if you're watching, it brought you a little bit of happiness,
Awesome.
So.
I love it. And
certainly a lot of humbleness.
Oh yeah, it's good stuff, man. It's everyone's got some beautiful collections in this community. Wow. It's breathtaking. So
wow, that's right.
All right, and this is BUB'S Comics signing off, and I'm reminding you all to read a comic. Thanks, and good night.
Good night.